Hey, I'm Dr. Hannah, and today we're going to talk about the order of eating food and how it can impact our blood glucose levels. Now, this is something that I learned as I was studying nutritional sciences at Texas A&M back in my undergraduate degree. And it was really helpful for me as someone with type 1 diabetes to figure this out and apply it to my life. Since I've had a couple conversations with Dr. Stephen Ponder, who wrote the book Sugar Surfing. He's an excellent pediatric endocrinologist. If you haven't heard of his work, I highly recommend checking it out. His book, Sugar Surfing, is the one that taught me the most about my diabetes care, and probably the one that I implement the most today as I practice self-care with my own type 1 diabetes. But what I would like to say about this is that understanding more about food can be a really empowering thing as we're looking at making more subtle choices and leaning in certain directions as it relates to food choices while we're trying to take care of our blood glucose and manage our diabetes. And if you have been in the type 1 community for a while now, you may know that online, on certain Facebook groups, on different blogs and forums, nutrition is highly controversial. I think we have a lot of different kind of subgroups of the type 1 diabetes community that feel very different ways about what is okay and what is not okay to eat. And it's funny that nutrition can be so emotionally jarring and emotionally impactful for people, but it makes a lot of sense, right? Because we need food to survive. It's not something that we can have a relationship with that's not working and then just say, okay, I'm going to quit food and I'll move on my way and it won't be a problem. We have to make decisions about how we eat every single day, multiple times a day, what foods we're choosing. And it's also a very emotional thing because often food is so intertwined with community. For I was going to say decades, but centuries, we've been sitting around, even back cavemen, right? We've been sitting around campfires eating together. We get together for family events like Thanksgiving and Christmas and we eat together. Food is so social and it's really emotional because of that, because community is so important to our lives. I think it's one of the things that creates a sense of fulfillment and well-being. And so it makes sense to me that nutrition is hard for people to find a peaceful relationship with when we have type 1 diabetes. And truthfully, in my practice of medicine, I meet a lot of people that have a challenged relationship with food who don't have type 1 diabetes, who don't have metabolic abnormalities. It's already hard. And then we add this layer of having to count or understand what we're eating and interpret it into a numeric kind of content so that we can dose insulin for it. That's hard. And so I would say that making peace with your relationship with food is probably the most important first step when it comes to then looking at how you may optimize your nutrition strategy to help with your blood glucose management. This is obviously much easier said than done. I want to start by saying that food and type 1 diabetes, I don't think that we have one right way. And that might be triggering for a lot of people who feel like there is one right way. But I have seen people thrive with happy, healthy lives, who are able to do the athletic things they want to do, who eat high carb, low protein vegan diets. I've seen people thrive with type 1 diabetes who eat low carb, high fat, more carnivorous based diets. I've seen people thrive with eating, honestly, higher processed food choices, kind of more of the standard American diet. And then I've seen people thrive on more paleo type or Mediterranean diets. And all of these people are happy. They feel good about their relationship with food. They have great blood glucose management that looks like non-diabetic levels. They're on a variety of shots or technology. I would say probably all of them use continuous glucose monitors and the ones that I can think of. But so it's possible to create a life where you can manipulate your diabetes or kind of change the settings of what you do in a way to live happy, healthy, fit, metabolically healthy by choosing all of these. Now, I can't say it's possible for these people I don't know if they chose this for every chapter of their life it would work, but in the chapter they were in, it was working. And so there's a lot of ways that it can be done that it can work. Now, as someone who has a background in nutritional sciences, I would say that staying away from processed food is really, really important. And I don't mean completely cutting it out of your life, but not making it a core component of where you get most of your calories is really important for all people. It doesn't matter if you have type 1 diabetes or not. That's not a, woe is me, I have type 1 diabetes, I can't eat Pop-Tarts anymore. It's probably not a good idea for any American child to eat Pop-Tarts every day or most days of the week. And that's just kind of the world we live in with the way that our agricultural system has shifted, what we know about nutrition. Nutrition is a very well-studied field. It is harder to study because we can't put people in a lab, right, and give them, weighed food. We do a lot of recall studies on what people say they ate. So it's a little bit, challenging to kind of look at. But what we do know is that we can very clearly see, if we're eating too much processed sugar, if we're eating too many processed grains, specifically, white flour based, if we're eating food with a lot of preservatives in it over and over again, that is negatively impactful for health. And I feel very confident to say that there's no question about that when we look at the systematic reviews, the meta-analyses on nutrition in general. Now, if you want to know the most well-studied, not necessarily the best, but the type of nutrition plan that we have the most data on as it relates to type 1 diabetes, based on the last time I looked through all of the literature that I could find, it was the Mediterranean diet. And so that is something that if you just kind of want to know what do we know the most about, that's the one that seems to be positively impactful that we have the most data on. Again, it doesn't mean it's the best one. It just means that's the best of what we know now as we're extracting data from the studies. Now, that doesn't mean it's the right one for you. I think that if we look at the world as a whole, we see that it doesn't make sense that people who live in Kenya and their ancestors have all lived in Kenya are going to thrive on the same types of foods as people who live in Alaska and their ancestors have all lived in Alaska. Our bodies change to the environment we live in. We know that, right? I mean, people who live in Miami are going to be more tan than people who live in Maine because our bodies can adapt to things. We have all these adaptations, and over time, especially over generations, we know that we're not all the same. We have different color hair, we have different color, eyes. We're not going to necessarily all need the exact same diet. So I don't think that we can say there is one right way. And that's a personal opinion. That is not something I extracted from the literature. That's just what makes sense to me as I look at the world from a big picture. Now, I say that to just mean that I think that what you choose for you in this chapter of your life has to be the right decision, that you make with your doctor based on your particular place. It might mean that you're in college and you have to eat out of the cafeteria. That's what I did. And that's where you are. And so you try to balance it out with some healthy movement and you learn about food along the way until you can make different choices. It might mean that you are living in a household as a kid in a family where you don't do the grocery shopping. So you just make the best choice that you can out of the refrigerator. And sometimes you don't make the best choice and you still love yourself and you make peace with it and you're okay. And so I think that if we put perfection on nutrition or we put very extreme parameters around ourselves, it can create, doesn't always, but it can create space for a really challenging relationship that can impact our relationship with ourselves. Do we feel deserving? Do we feel shame? It can impact our relationship with other people. Do we feel like we can connect with them? Do we feel like we're a burden? So we have to be really careful as we navigate this nutrition conversation. But the question I want to address specifically is food, and does the order that we eat it in change our glycemic impact? Now, if you're wearing a continuous glucose monitor, you're super lucky because you can answer this question for yourself. Our bodies are all different. Our digestive systems have a lot of variety. But what we see in general is that if we have a carbohydrate that is more processed, and by processed, I mean not necessarily processed as in the fast food kind of category we were talking about before, but broken down. So we're looking at things like apple juice, right? It's ground up, watered down apples. If we're looking at something that's going to be maybe a smoothie we made with some frozen pineapple chunks and whatever else. If we're looking at a lollipop, right, that's just going to be kind of like sugar and water and food coloring, whatever else they put in there. If we're looking at candy, things that are going to be more broken down sugars. So we're not looking at the overall carbs and starches. We're looking at the sugar content those things are going to hit our system fast. And you probably already know that. That's why I use those things to treat lows. But what we see is that if we add a little bit of fat and protein, it slows down the absorption of that carbohydrate. So fats are things that are going to look like often animal proteins have fat. People can buy kind of lower fat curated options, but often animal proteins, we're looking at things like avocados, olive oil, butter, nut butter. Nuts have a lot of high fat. Actually, most of the calories in nuts come from fat. We're looking at coconut oil. We're looking at coconut, milk, the fully canned kind. And a lot of times if we are eating those more processed foods, we're going to have additives like soybean oil, canola oil. Those are more inflammatory fats. And so I usually, for my personal patients, would advise against eating those. Again, not true for everybody, but I'm a huge fan of reducing your canola oil intake as much as possible. Now, with that, when we look at fats, we see that if we combine the fat and the carbohydrate, fats take a really long time for our body to digest. So if we mix sugar and fat together, it's going to take a really long time for our body to digest. So let's use let's use an example that you may be clear to you. So I'm going to use some foods that I know a lot of people with type 1 diabetes use. So let's take one glucose tab. What are we looking at? Like 3 to 4 grams of carbs, straight glucose. If you're wearing a continuous glucose monitor, or even if you're not and you know how you feel, you can kind of pretty clearly see that increase on the graph with quite a high slope, right? It's going to push your blood sugar up pretty fast. If we take a tablespoon of peanut butter, and let's say we pick one of those peanut butters that's got like a high fructose corn syrup in it, it's got a lot of added sugar. That's most of them on the market. You really have to look at the kind of the back of the bottle if you want one without it. But let's say we pick one of those. It has 4 or 5 grams of sugar in the peanut butter. Now, it also has ground peanuts, which has moderate protein, high fat content. That peanut butter is not going to do the same thing for your blood sugar as the glucose tab. We're going to see a much, much, much slower peak on the graph. It may not peak as high because it's kind of the glucose that's coming into our bloodstream is more drawn out. And so obviously this example is in the setting of not taking insulin to cover it. You're going to see a very different kind of response on your graph. Now, that is true and very clear, I think, for a lot of people. But when we're looking at a whole plate of food, we're able to then kind of use that understanding in a more macro effort to understand how foods are going to affect us. So I will give an example of how I do this in a real life setting because I think that's the easiest way to teach it. So if I am going to, let's say I'm sitting down with a plate and I've got some grilled chicken, I've got some sweet potatoes, and I've got some kale chips. And my blood sugar, let's say I got distracted. I pre-bolused, I got distracted doing the dishes before I sat down to eat or something. And I'm dropping a little bit faster than I want to. Let's say I'm already like 75 kind of down arrow. I'm not going to start by eating my chicken, and I'm not going to start by eating my kale chips because those are lower in carb. They're a lot more fibrous. They're going to take longer to digest the carbs from the kale chips, and there's just not as many. Obviously, I'm going to start eating my sweet potato first so that I can kind of get that graph to start moving up in the right direction so I don't feel low while I'm eating. Now, with that, what I'll probably notice is that my blood sugar will start coming up sooner than if I ate those other pieces first. This is pretty intuitive. Then I would eat my kale chips and my chicken after, knowing that those carbs and the sweet potatoes are already starting to digest. I probably caught my insulin curve pretty good. It doesn't always happen that way, but this is intuitive. So let's say my blood sugar is 150. I pre-bolused. I gave my correction. I'm sitting down to eat. I would prefer to wait till it drops a little bit lower, but everybody else is sitting down. We're all wanting to eat together. What I might do is sit down and say, okay, I'm going to start with the kale chips. I know there's not a whole lot of carbs in there. They're really fibrous. If I eat those, they're going to take me a while to eat. So I'll have those. And then I might notice my blood glucose is still kind of riding 140, maybe down arrow, just still not where I would usually want it to be if I'm going to start a meal. So then I'm saying, oh, okay, well, I'll eat my chicken next, right? Because I'm still waiting on that insulin to kick in more and more so I can kind of get to a lower level before I bring those carbs on board to try and match the carbohydrate and insulin timing so I get those curves to go together. And so then I'll eat my chicken. and then I'll eat the sweet potatoes. Now, again, this is nuanced. And if you're brand new to type 1 diabetes, this might be helpful. It might be overwhelming. But if you've had type 1 diabetes for a while and you've been kind of autopilot with insulin timing and eating, especially for people who, and I did this for a long time, so there's no shame at all. But if you are sitting down to your meal, eyeballing it, bolusing, and then starting to eat, you probably haven't thought about this because you're not thinking about the timing of your insulin so much anyway. It wasn't really until I got a clear habit of pre-bolusing, or common habit of pre-bolusing, that I was able to start watching my graph in order to determine when I wanted to start my meal. And then that's when the food order really started to show up and make a difference in my graphs. So if you are one of those people that is bolusing right when you sit down for a meal, it may be advantageous, and again, talk with your physician, but it may be advantageous to eat all the low carb, high protein, high fat foods first, and then go for the carbs later. That could be a strategy. I think it's always, as a general approach, superior to pre-bolus, because that's really the only way, even with Lumjev and Fiasp, the two newer fast-acting insulins, for most people, that's really the only way to match your carb absorption and your insulin timing, unless you're not eating a whole lot of carbohydrates. If I'm going to eat a very low carb meal, let's say I'm going to eat, or a low carb snack, so let's say like a celery and a handful of almonds, and I want to bolus for it, or correct and bolus for it, I might not worry, so much about the timing as far as pre-bolusing there. But in general, if we're going to eat a moderate carb meal, it makes a difference. So that would be the first thing I would focus on, and then I would try to get the food order in. But you could technically do it in either order. And again, this is what I would do. So I think that that's helpful to understand. So we typically, at least from some of our diabetes education, if you got it, you may understand what foods have higher carbs, what foods have lower carbs. You may not have yet learned what foods have higher protein, lower protein, what foods have higher fiber content, what foods have higher fat content. Those things tend to slow down the absorption of our carbohydrates that are in the meal, and so it can change things. And they also are much slower absorbed. So this is helpful. And again, I'm using very kind of basic foods here to try and keep things simple. But one way of learning food content is to just start studying it. And I don't mean like pull out a textbook and read. I just mean if you're going to eat a meal pretty consistently, like I probably eat a lot of similar lunches throughout the week, I might just start with one of the most common meals that I eat. And then learn, okay, is this a high protein meal? Is this a low protein meal? Is this a high fat meal? Is this a low fat meal? Does it make a difference for me as I practice, day in, day out, eating this meal? If I change the order of how I eat it based on where my graph is moving for my blood glucose. And that's kind of what this process looks like. Now, there are a couple different apps now that are very cool that can actually allow you to take a picture of your meal, and it gives you an estimation of your carbohydrates. It gives you an estimation of your fat and your protein content. I haven't used these personally yet, but I know some physicians who have found them favorable. So I might say if you are using one, there's a couple on the market now. Guru is the one that I can think of that relates to type 1 diabetes the most. Just maybe double check yourself a little bit in the beginning. I know that I tried it and I took a picture of a black cup of coffee, which is, truthfully trying to trick it, and it thought it was soy sauce. So just know that there's going to be some errors there, but it's a great place to start. And it certainly it's nice to have something to kind of double check your own knowledge, or make it a little bit faster than having to Google individual ingredients, etc. Another app that I love, if you're going to look at learning, is something called Chronometer, and I'll link these below. But Chronometer is a interesting app. They have a free version, they have a paid version, but what is interesting and different than some of the others is that when you log a meal, it tells you not just the carbohydrate, fat, protein, calorie content, it also tells you the fiber content, and it can also break down the micronutrients, so vitamins and minerals. And if you're going to do a couple of days of food tracking just to get an idea, are you getting enough calories? Are you getting too many? What does your total carbohydrates look like? Are you getting enough protein, etc., for whatever goal you might have? I like this one because it can kind of ballpark like, oh, you're not getting enough fiber when we look at the recommendations from the American Diabetic Association, or you're not getting maybe any vitamin C, right? So then you might want to add that on. There are different things that we can kind of look at, but it's helpful just to kind of ballpark those pieces because vitamins and minerals are so important for the way that our body makes and produces energy. And so it's not just about the macronutrients. And that's really where the food quality piece comes in. When we're choosing more whole foods, we're often getting a lot more vitamins and minerals. So that's a fun way to learn that. I'm not a huge fan of counting calories, and I'm not a huge fan of doing it long term. I think it can be a really useful tool if we do 3-day check-ins. So it's enough to put a little bit of extra steps on your day for 3 days, but it's not something where we're chronically stressing ourselves out over. I don't think that writing down everything we eat every day for months and months at a time, I don't think that it's necessary, but I also, for most people, again, there are outliers, but I also don't think that it creates an environment where it is at all easy to have a healthy relationship with food, because the more numbers we look at associated with our food, right? We've already got these blood glucose numbers we're monitoring daily. If we're also monitoring protein and fat and calorie long term, it creates a space where we've got all these numbers that we are trying to kind of micromanage in our life, and it can put stress on ourselves. I'm a huge fan of creating a healthy lifestyle with healthy habits, which means I'm getting enough sleep. I'm avoiding most processed foods. I definitely eat processed foods sometimes. I'm getting good exercise. I'm not super stressed. And then getting my body to a healthy BMI and then listening to my appetite. And it is so possible to be happy, healthy, have great blood sugar, have your goal A1C, have a BMI that's within the healthy range, and be able to listen to your appetite to maintain that. And for some reason, when I was in my 20s, I didn't know that that was possible. I thought we had to kind of micromanage things because we had type 1 diabetes. So I definitely went too far in the counting range and the kind of over-analysis of numbers, where I stopped listening to my body's own signals and cues for what it needed. And I think that that's important that we talk about. The last thing I want to say, because it's somewhat related, and again, just another thing that I learned way later in life, is that for women who are menstruating, the week before our menstruation, we, not as a whole, but some individuals need a lot more insulin, and we often, as women, need more calories. And so if you are more hungry prior to the start of your menstruation when you're bleeding, don't judge yourself. Don't think there's something wrong with you because you are more hungry, you're needing more snacks or bigger meals. That's part of a healthy hormonal balance. And so I think that listening to your appetite in those settings then helps set you up for more hormonal balance if you're choosing foods that are not highly processed. When we are choosing foods that are highly processed, let's say we're eating things with a lot of processed sugar or processed flour, like we talked about, more preservatives, it can trick our brain to thinking that we should continue eating past our appetite signals. And so it's really hard to listen to our appetite if we have a lot of fast food or processed foods in our diet, because we've got kind of these other things changing our neurochemical signaling. So with that, maybe more details than you wanted to know, but I want to say it because I wish, again, I had learned this about my body sooner. Everything I'm saying today is general medical education. This is not personal medical advice. If you want to make changes about your diabetes care, your nutrition, I highly recommend you talk to your endocrinologist or your primary care physician before you implement changes. This is just to let you know that there is more out there than you may have learned before. So if it helped, please like and subscribe. That makes a big difference to me as I can make time to continue to create these videos. I really appreciate you sticking it out to the end. And as always, let me know if you have any questions. I'd love to continue making more videos about nutrition and type 1 diabetes.